All right, y'all. This is going to be chapter 10 or lecture 10. This is going to be about the state and local bureaucracies, basically. Okay, so the first slide is going to be the basics. We should all know that the bureaucracy is basically just an appendage of the executive branch, right? At the federal level, that means they generally work for the president. At the state level, that means they generally work for the governor. And at the local level, it means they generally work under either the sort of council, the city council, or the mayor. And we'll talk about that later in the semester. Their organizational characteristics come from the research of Max Weber, who was sort of a political scientist slash philosopher slash government wonk. He's an interesting character, but he says there's basically five characteristics of what makes up a bureaucratic entity, right? The first is division of labor. I mean, obviously, this kind of comes from industrialization and, Ford and these sorts of things, like have people do what they're good at, right? So, a division of labor. You have a hierarchy, of course, and it's very charted out at these government institutions. They spend more time than they ever should mapping out the hierarchy in the organization, it often seems. They have formal rules, right? There's usually some sort of handbook for employees, for bosses, for, I don't know, contracting decisions, all kinds of different things. Um, they have a maintenance of files and records, right? So usually the public can approach one of these institutions with a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, and request, documents going back however long, whatever. And then finally, you have professionalization and merit. Excuse me, professionalization and merit. Usually, these jobs are supposed to be based on your sort of skills, your credentials, and on merit rather than on political ideology, etc. So we'll get into a little bit of that later too. All right. Um, these organizations, these institutions generally have two main roles as well. They're not only there to implement policies, right? Of course, the legislature writes the law, and then the executive branch is supposed to carry it out. And so, in that way, they are policy implementers, right? But they're also interpreters because we've talked about before. A lot of the time, these laws can be pretty vague and just sort of set a goal or something, and then they leave it to the bureaucracy and the professionals to figure out what is the best way to approach whatever problem it's supposed to be fixing to reach that goal, right? Okay. The next slide basically sort of shows you how a policy is made through the policy life cycle, right? Like you have to formulate the policy. A lot of times, this is either legislator staff or it's actual lobbying groups or lobbyists who just sort of plop down a bill they want to see passed on someone's desk. And then it goes to the policy adoption stage, right? So that's the subcommittees and the committees, and it goes to the House floor and the Senate, and everybody votes and all that. Then it goes to sort of policy implementation, right? And here, I think they should have put some sort of interpretation piece in there as well. But they have to interpret it, and then they implement it, and then they evaluate it, and then they maintain it, and then sort of it goes back around, right? Maybe we need to make some fixes. Maybe we need to write a new law, whatever it might be. Okay. Policy implementation. Excuse me. There are a lot of different sort of subcategories here. First, they have to issue grants and contracts, right? So a lot of times the government itself is not carrying out these missions, right? The government might not be, building a government building or building a road. They have to put out um, a report, or they have to put out basically a grant. Man, what would you even call it? Sort of a competition, you know what I mean? Where everybody has to all of these different companies come to the government and say, okay, we can fulfill this contract for this much. Here's our plan, blah, 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 right? And then the government um, will choose the winner and then sign a contract with them, right? And start the project. And at that point, the I guess those who won the contract can start tapping into sort of federal money, right? Um, so this leads to arguably it leads to efficiencies in spending and in decision making, right? Because you're supposed to supposedly have very professional people analyzing the decisions. You're cutting costs essentially by making companies compete for the contract, right? So this should, in theory, lower the cost through the competition mechanism. And so, yeah, theoretically, this can be a good thing, right? You also have to enforce laws and regulations, right? And so this, of course, has to do with criminal laws, and I think that's the more well-known side of things is the criminal courts. But the government's job and these bureaucracies' job is often also to ensure that these other branches of crimes or illegalities or whatever you might call them uh, are policed as well, right? So our financial institutions like banks and insurance agencies, this was a big topic post 2008 crash, and why the FTC and others didn't sort of hold anyone accountable. You have economic regulations and enforcement that need to be monitored, right? So this would be generally the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission, or the Justice Department, right? And that's at the federal level, but we also have monitoring at state levels as well. You have corporate crimes, right? Or corporate abuse against consumers. So for a while, we had what was called the Financial Consumer Protection Bureau. It was created under the Obama administration, under Elizabeth Warren, I think, from Massachusetts, who was a senator. Um, a little bit more on the sort of the left side, but also very wonky because she was like a Harvard professor or something. But anyway, this was supposed to protect consumers against like rapacious banks or bad lending practices or things like that. But I think the Trump administration got rid of this recently. Um, and then you have environmental protection, and so this is going to be under things like the EPA. But we also again have state institutions that watch this. I actually have a really good friend who I graduated from tech with, and he was in sort of a soil science. And so he got a job for an institution working for the state of Texas. And he goes out and tests for like acidity and all these sorts of things in rivers and soil around central Texas. So, there are a lot of other sort of paradigms of the law that have to be considered by the state than just criminal law, right? And sometimes it feels like that's just about all that they ever focus on, and that might be true, but there are purportedly these other sort of subcategories, right? Okay. They also have to undertake and manage these programs, right? So they have to set the budget, they have to do the hiring, they have to deal with the task management situations, they have to review all of the bids and contracts and all of these sorts of things. Go away, Fly. And so, yeah, these institutions have a lot to do when it comes to the policy implementation side. Okay, on the other side, policy interpretation, we basically have like three different types, right? You have the street level decision making, and sort of where we collect data on this stuff, right? So this is going to be cops, inspectors, scientists, right? So like every restaurant or Starbucks or whatever it might be, at least 4 times a year, I think it is, they have to be inspected by a local health inspector, and generally that's it's supposed to be like random and unknown, right? And so you have people always watching to make sure that the safety standards, the cleanliness standards, these sorts of things are being implemented properly so that they can keep their licensure, right? And then you have scientists, again, like I was talking about my buddy earlier, who just sort of collects data on, you know, agricultural land, soil, water, all these sorts of things, so that they can compile all of this data and get a good picture of sort of where we are with our environmental standards and things of that sort. Okay, they also have to do rulemaking, right? So we've talked many times. It's very vague, the laws that are generally written, and they have to become very detailed instructions on how to implement a plan to achieve a goal, right? And so usually what happens is they'll generally put through an entire process, right? It's like a maybe 6 months, a year long process where they'll collect data, they'll write reports, they'll review reports, they'll have high level meetings about how to approach this. They'll talk to their legal staff, and then they will even put out like a mandatory public opinion period where if they're going to change some type of law or implement some new rule, they have to open it up to citizens of the state to be able to comment and maybe contextualize or these sorts of things. And then they can sort of put these administrative rules into place. Now, generally, the Chevron ruling, it's called the Chevron ruling from the 1970s. The Supreme Court basically said that, yeah, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but um, yes, lawmakers cannot write every single nitty gritty particular of all of the, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands of problems we have in our society. And so, yes, these administrative rules will carry the weight of American law, right? And there's a process that you have to follow to be able to put these rules in, like we just discussed, or whatever. You can't just like willy nilly change things on a dime. There has to be a process and reviews and all these sorts of things. But once it is established, it carries the weight of law. Now, recently, under the more recent Supreme Court, under the sort of I guess Trump appointees, they've been walking this back a little bit and maybe leaving room for the idea that like these particular rules that are set by bureaucracies or bureaucrats will not hold the weight of law, and it has to actually be written into law by the House and the Senate, which arguably is an impossibility. Those guys can't get anything done. So um, it'll be interesting to see how this works out moving forward, and whether the administrative bureaucracies get sort of, I don't know, neutered, by the courts. Okay. And then third, the bureaucracies, this is not really their supposed to be their role, but it does happen in reality, right? They push policy agendas. And this seems to have becoming more and more common in contemporary periods, right? The leaders of these institutions, usually like the deputies, excuse me, like the maybe the chair and then the deputies and the vice deputies. So the very top of the pyramid are appointed by a governor or the president of the United States, et cetera, right? Excuse me. Some of these positions are actually elected, right? So like the sheriff in your county is usually an elected position, these sorts of things. Um, but most of at least the state level stuff is appointed by the governor. Now there are exceptions, right? So we have like the Secretary of State gets elected, but like consider the Department of Education of Texas, right? Like apparently he's a pretty far right guy who was appointed by Abbott, and that kind of thing. And it's Texas. I'm pointing out the right. They do the same thing in California on the left, so I'm not picking a side here. Um, but we do know that this sort of infects their policy decisions and implementations, and then what are even rules that might be on the books, are they going to actually enforce them during their tenure, these sorts of things, right? And maybe it affects hiring decisions, right? These sorts of things. It's not supposed to, again, but you never really know sometimes, and sometimes they just come out and blatantly state it, right? Um, Now, their job is to represent their governor or their constituency, right? And so there is an argument to be made for sort of a politicization, especially maybe among the leadership, right? And then there are protections for those who are sort of lower down the ladder as sort of policy wonks. Um, but this is kind of an interesting movement in our country, and it's even moving into the quote unquote protected institutions, right? There are a handful of institutions that the courts have said sort of rise above all the rest, even, right? Like there's the bureaucracy, and then there's like this untouchable bureaucracy, right? And the quote unquote untouchables are like the Fed, right? The people who make decisions about our inflation rates and things like that, or interest rates, excuse me, who are supposed to support full employment, and then to try and keep inflation at about a 2% level, right? And they're supposed to be an independent central bank, is what they call it. But there has been a lot of pressure under the Trump administration to sort of strong arm Jerome Powell and others at the Fed, and even trying to fire, I think it's the Fed governor of New York, right? And so this is going to be a future Supreme Court case as well. They have announced that they will hear at least that woman's the Fed governor of New York, Lisa something. The Supreme Court will hear her case in January, but they have thus far protected her from being fired by the Trump administration. The Justice Department is another that is supposed to be completely clear of political involvement, right? Where the president is not supposed to get involved in whomever might be charged by the Justice Department. But again, we're seeing a shift here, right? And again, I hate to just pick on the Trump administration, but it seems to be sort of ramping up significantly under the Trump administration, with the going after people like James Comey and Letitia James, and even saying that he's going to charge some of our like congresspersons from the Democratic Party, like Chuck Schumer. Um, and so, like, if there's something there, there's something there. But thus far, they have provided very little evidence for some of these things. So that sort of stuff gets pretty concerning. And then finally, the courts. There are political scientists out there who are saying the courts are becoming much more polarized as well. Not only at sort of the Supreme Court level, which is sort of a deadlock on the right at this point, 6-3, but also in the sort of lower federal courts, and then especially at the state level, where there's so much gerrymandering, right? Okay, so we'll move on from there. All right. The next slide is about scope. We can see sort of how big and small the state, local, and federal employment levels are, right? And so a lot of people are surprised to find out that the federal bureaucracy is far smaller than sort of the state and local bureaucracy, right? The federal bureaucracy right now, the estimate is at around 2.2 to 2.5 million. Usually it's around 3 million ish. But we have been seeing sort of a dramatic, not only resignations, but also firing of sort of federal employees. Um, the state governments make up a little bit more than that, right? So around 3 to 3.5 million employees. And then the local governments have exploded over time, right? So we have more than 11 million full time uh, bureaucrats at the local level, and about 5 million additional more at the who are part time. Excuse me. And then I would also point out, I think we talked about it earlier in the semester, maybe in one of our first classes, but there is sort of a negative correlation between population density and the number of bureaucrats who work in your district. So the funny thing is, usually, like rural voters tend to be the ones who are really hot about bureaucracy, but they actually tend to have more bureaucrats per capita. And it's because of sort of just efficiencies of scale from an economic standpoint, where you can have one, um, I don't know, let's pick a topic. Let's say, um, oh, post birth state visits, right, to check on the health of the mother and the child. Well, you're probably going to have need a lot more nurses in a giant, spread out rural community, at least when you talk about per head, right? Than you will in a very tightly packed urban community, where the nurse might be able to visit many more heads per day, right? And it's that sort of weird efficiency of scale, that means that urban areas actually use fewer bureaucrats and get more bang for their buck, I guess you would say, than rural regions. Okay, we will move on. The next slide: bureaucracy in American history. Much of bureaucracy was left sort of to the private sector, right? Um, there were schools and there were a handful of like universities or libraries, but for the most part, bureaucracy was provided by citizens and supported by the sort of hyper wealthy generally. And so it's funny if you go back and watch. HBO made a show called Sam Adams, about sort of the Boston Tea Party movement and his life, etc. But at one point there's a fire and all the citizens have to run and grab this like hand pump fire truck, and all the pumps are frozen because it's dead in winter. I mean, it was just a disaster, but it gives you sort of an idea of how this was managed at the time, right? Um, Staffing in the government positions that did exist was largely aristocratic, right? These were the very elites, the one who had attended the private universities like Harvard and Yale. And then I guess around the Andrew Jackson period, they started introducing the spoil system or the patronage system, which led to a pretty big change in our government mechanisms. And so this led to sort of the machine politics in the cities, right? Remember again that there wasn't really private voting, what we call the Australian ballot now. It was just out in front of everybody. Like, if you're going to vote for this guy, you walk to that side of the room. If you're going to vote for that guy, you walk to that side of the room. And, there's people standing outside with bats and stuff. And so, like, it was a little bit more nerve wracking back then, and they would also just pay for votes and things like that. Like it was pretty messy back in the day, right? It looked a little like maybe like Mexican elections. If you ever see, like, they get pretty chaotic in some spots where people are just like handing out money, like pay for my candidate, vote for my candidate, these kind of things. Um, this also generally meant doling out government jobs and contracts to cronies, right? And so you got a lot of corruption during this time. They would, the mayor or the governor or whatever would hand out a contract and then get a kickback from that company from the contract they just handed them, and it just sort of is a self-perpetuating system. And we got lots and lots of corruption during this sort of Gilded Age period. But this led in the next slide to some changes during the progressive era, excuse me, from sort of the late 19th century, right, the 1890s or so, to the early 20th century. A lot of people were getting very frustrated. A lot of American citizens. There were sort of mass protests. There was anger about the corruption. There had started to be like bombings and assassinations by anarchists and others, and so we moved in a much different direction, and into sort of the merit system of bureaucracy during this period. And so the first real sort of movement in this direction was the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. This brought the examination system into the government, right? You had to show that you had general knowledge of the area that you were being hired under. This brought security from political dismissals, right? So, a lot of these firings in the federal government right now are being sort of fought under this Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act structure of law. Um, and it was supposed to offer you sort of protection from being coerced into any political activities. Like you did not have to pay dues to a party, or a party could not really even charge you dues if you were working in the government, right? Later in 1939, under FDR, we brought the Hatch Act. And the Hatch Act basically said that employees of the government cannot be either coerced into political activities, but also cannot participate in political activities, especially regarding voting, and that like you couldn't show up as an employee of the government if you were going to do, political campaigning or protesting or whatever. You have to do it in your private life, and there are pretty big limits on what you can do. Um, in recent years, especially moving into the 1960s, we start getting equal pay rules, anti-discrimination laws, right? Not only for race, but also for um, gender, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, things of this sort, right? And then whistleblowing protections have sort of gotten stronger and stronger over the years, though pretty much every administration goes after whistleblowers pretty hard. And that includes Trump and Biden and Obama and Bush and Clinton. And like, it does not matter. Presidents or governors, whomever it may be, do not like whistleblowing from inside their administration. And then the Social Security Act pushed a lot of these sort of rules, like the Pendleton system, the Hatch Act, etc., onto the states, right? Because a lot of this was just federal law for the federal bureaucracy. But the Social Security Act of 1935, again under FDR, said that if you want our sort of largesse, if you want our financial handouts from the federal government to kickstart our economy again, then you are going to have to participate in these rules, right? And so we need to get politics out of governing, right? Okay. The final slide. Oh, it's just about unionization, basically. We know that unions can be powerful from statistical research. That unions can be pretty powerful in things like raising minimum wages or reducing inequality in a society, for example. But America has a pretty harsh history when it comes to unions, from union busting, during the industrial period, um, to assassinations of union leaders, um, to the firing of the air traffic controllers under the Reagan administration. We have a pretty rough history with that because we're so sort of staunchly anti-communist. And so we don't really have much of a union visibility in the United States. Around 7 to 9% of private employment is unionized from differing sort of reports, while about a third of all public sector workers are unionized, right? And so generally, this gives the public sector a little bit more power in determining things like their wages, in guaranteeing their position, and their retirement benefits, things like this, right? Now, I would say union membership is rising, even though here it only goes to about 2010, but post 2008 and then COVID have really sort of pushed a little bit more I guess, acceptance of unionization and what unions do. I also think, like, as the Cold War dies out of people's minds, they forget about the tie between sort of unions and Marxist thought. Uh, And so we have seen, especially among younger generations, more support in surveys and things of that sort for unions. And union membership is rising very slightly, but we still are in no way competing with most of like the European countries or anything when it comes to union membership, right? Um, all right, I think that's all I've got for you. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you all on Monday. Have a great day.